Hello guys, so in this video here I want to cover the concept of trig functions. And how I want to cover the concept of trig functions is that I want to do it answering a previous paper. We already have a former video to this one, so please make sure you watch the video before you watch this one, right? So here we are answering a question paper from the year 2022, and then in this paper here we want to answer one question that speaks to trig functions, right? So this was a provincial paper and it was a grade 11 paper. So you see the terrors that happened during the final during the last paper for November. This is what happens, right? Okay, so here's question 6. Question 6, there's a diagram here and there are questions here. You know how we do this. We know that the whole page cannot fit in a PowerPoint, so I'll keep on switching from this point to this point here, right? This is the diagram, these are the questions. So the diagram here, it says in the diagram below, the graphs of f of x is equals to a sine bx plus 1, right? And then g of x is equals to 2x, it's equals to 2 cosine x plus p. And then they're saying that these are shown for the intervals -90 up until 180 degrees. So the questions here are saying, let's say 6.1. First, they need us to find the amplitude of G. So let's answer that. The amplitude of G. Let's choose a thinner pen. Yeah. So for the graph of G, the amplitude in this case, we find it as follows. We're going to say here that, let me use a red pen here. So here's the graph of G. The graph of G is this one here. And then they told us here that the graph of G, it's a cosine graph, right? So that is that. Now, if the graph of G is a cosine graph, and then we know that it's this one here, our amplitude, it's the highest point and minus the lowest point. Then we take that, we divide that by 2. So the formula for amplitude, it's half maximum value minus minimum value. So the amplitude will be equals to half of what is the highest value, it's 2, minus what is the lowest value, it's -2, right? So now the amplitude will be equals to half of 4. What is half of 4? That is 2, right? So this means now your amplitude is 2. Easy as that. Now next question. Next question wants us to find the period of f. So the period of f in this case, you must remember the formula, but let's start with the graph of f. Which part here represents the graph of f? So here's the graph of f here. Hope you see it. It moves from here, it goes up there, it goes down, it goes up there, then down again, right? So on this graph of f, when we are looking at the period, we want to see where this graph starts and where does it end. So since the graph of f is a sine graph, we know that it must form an S shape or an S shape this way, right? So now we see that this graph starts here, right? It moves down, it goes up, and then it returns back here again. So this is a full wave for this sine graph. How many degrees did it take us? Well, from 0 to here, it took us 120 degrees. It means now our period for this graph, for us to get one full wave, we need 120 degrees. That's what the period speaks about. Next question says, those things were all 1 mark each. So the next question now, it says, find for us or determine the values of A, B, and P. That is 3 marks. That's 6.3. Let me write it there. We want to find A, B, and P. That'll be doable, very doable. Okay, let's start with A. Where do we find A? A is found on the sine graph right here. And then A, it's the coefficient of sine. The coefficient of sine, we said it always represents the amplitude. So here, we're actually looking for the amplitude of sine. So here's a sine graph here, the graph of f. So the graph of f here, its amplitude, it's the distance from the point of rest. Let me show you the point. This is the point of rest, because from this point, this is the halfway point from the highest point to the lowest point. All right. Or you can just use the amplitude formula. It's always safer to use the amplitude formula. So here, to calculate for A, we can use the amplitude formula that says half max. I'll put this on my writing pad properly. Yeah. Half maximum value minus minimum value. Right. So our A is equals to half. What is the maximum value? The highest value for that graph, it's 2. Minus what is the minimum value? The minimum value is here at 0. So this is the same as half of 2. And what is half of 2? That is 1. So which means our A value here is 1. But we need to look at such an important fact here, that this graph, when it starts, let me highlight that for you. This graph, when it starts here, it goes down first. Then it goes up, then it goes down again here, and then it returns there. We see that. So now, if this is the starting point, it starts by going down, it goes up, then it gets back here. That's a full wave here. So, since this graph starts by going down, it's a negative sine graph. Hope we're good there. So our A is, oops, that's too bad. Our A is as follows. Our A is equals to -1. Why? This part here is the amplitude. The 1 is the amplitude. The negative here is the direction. So we are saying that our A is -1. Here I wrote it there. I removed all the other stuff because it might disturb us, right? So now we have to get to the part whereby we are looking for B. Now, how do we find B? Look at this one here. B is found on this graph here, the sine graph, right? And it is what B, it's a value that actually tells us how many waves do we have in 360, right? So for this sine graph, let me show you something here. For this sine graph, we are saying that this sine graph starts here, it goes down, it goes up until there, it goes down again. At this point here, it's 120 degrees. It's already having a full wave, right? So there's a formula to this thing. And the formula to calculate this thing goes as follows. It says to us, if ever we have the period, we can then use this formula to find the K value, right? What is our period? Let's substitute. Period, we said for this graph, it's 120 degrees. And we even showed it here. It takes us 120 degrees for us to get a full wave, right? That being equals to 360 degrees all over. What is our K value? Our K value is the coefficient of B there. That coefficient of B, the coefficient of X in a sine graph, that is B. So I put B there, right? So now, in this case, I want to solve for B. I'll multiply this side by B. I'll multiply this side by B. So I have B 120 degrees. It's equals to 360 degrees. How do I remove the 120 from 360? Basically, I just say this part divided by 120 degrees and this part divided by 120 degrees. Therefore, my B will be equals to 3. Be good. So that's our B value there. And then the last part, P, calculating P. How can we calculate for P? So first we see that P is on this equation here, the equation of cosine. The graph of cosine is this one, is the graph of G. So basically P tells you that this graph was supposed to start on the y-axis, but now it's no longer starting on the y-axis. It starts elsewhere because it was moved P values, right? So now let's start with the cosine graph. If the cosine graph is supposed to have its highest point here on the y-axis, but then now it no longer has its highest point here. Let me remove this. It no longer has its highest point here. It now has its highest point here. Right, where does the highest point happen? Instead of happening at the y-axis, the highest point now happens 30 degrees later, right? So which means this graph, instead of it starting on the y-axis, it was shifted 30 degrees to the left. Now when the graph is shifted 30 degrees to the left, our p value, it becomes a positive 30 degrees. So instead of the sign, when it goes to the left, instead of it becoming what you think it should, it actually becomes the opposite, right? So moving to the left, it's a plus 30. Moving to the right, it's a minus 30. That's how it always is, right? So we found those. Let's get to the next part. The next part, now we have to answer 6.4, and this is pure graph interpretation now. So at this point here, it says determine the values of x. So our answer should be in terms of x. So determine the value or values of x such that the graph of G is greater than the graph of, it's greater than 0, right? So I wrote this thing here so I don't switch around. So first you need to highlight the graph of G. Here's the graph of G here. This is the graph of G. Right there. Now they want you to tell us where is this graph above 0. So now that is easy. The part where this graph is above 0, I'll show you now. It's here. I removed the part that was below 0. I left the part now that is above 0. 0, it's anywhere below the x-axis here. So these values below the x-axis, that's when it's below. This value is above the x-axis, that's when it's above 0, right? So you put this thing now in terms of an inequality. You're going to say the parts whereby your x values represent a positive graph for G, they happen as follows. They happen from negative 90 degrees up until what? Up until positive 60 degrees. And then you go back to the graph again. You interpret it. You go to 90 degrees. At exactly 90 degrees, is the graph still above 0? Yes. Then if the graph is still above 0, we include that value by putting a line here that represents greater than or equals to. And then you go to 60 degrees. At 60 degrees, is the graph above the x-axis? No. At 60 degrees, the graph is exactly at the x-axis. So which means here we don't put a line here. We leave it like that. Easy, right? Next question. Next question says, tell us where the graph of f is greater than the graph of G. Let me write that down. Where the graph of f is greater than the graph of G. Now, again, this is the part where we have to highlight the whole things, right? So the graph of f is this one. The only part where this graph is ever above the graph of G, it's here. So at this point, this graph that you see here, at this point here, it's above these values here. So here the graph of G, it's below. Once it gets here, they cross. Now the graph of G becomes above. It keeps on being above. Here they are equal. Then it keeps on being above, right? So here, let's put it into writing. The only points whereby that is true, it happens happens as follows. It happens when x is between this point here. This point is what? There's a value there. I'm not sure if you can see it. It is 48,05 degrees up until what? Up until 180 degrees. You see that? Now, the question here, it said greater than or equals to. So, which means here, I need to put my equal sign here. I need to put my equal sign here on the statement. Now, we are saying the point where the graph of f, it's either equal to the graph of g or greater than the graph of g. The 2 points where these graphs are equal now. This brings another situation. The 2 points where these graphs are equal, it's here and then it's here. So this part here, because it's already represented here, I'll put a line that at 48,05 degrees, the graphs are equal. Afterwards, the graph of f becomes above the graph of g up to a point whereby we have 180 degrees. Now, at 180 degrees, is the graph of f above the graph of g? Yes, it's still above. So I'll include that. You see that? And afterwards, that's not the only point. That's not the only point. And that's why this thing now, it's worth how much? 2 marks, right? Those are not the only points. The other points whereby now, obviously, there's no other point where the two graphs are, where one graph is above the other, especially for G. But then at this point here, we said the graphs are equal. So I have to include that part also. I'm going to say, and when x is equals to negative 30 degrees. So the mark is here and the mark is there. Hope we're good. So last question. Last question, they want to know when is the product of these two graphs a negative answer? Now that's interesting. Let me write it down. When 6.4.3, when is f of x times g of x less than 0? There's no equal sign, right? Yes, there's no equal sign. Now, basically here what I want you to do, and we already discussed this in the previous video, I want you to calculate for me whereby these graphs are all positive or they are all negative. Now, if we look at that, judging by this horizontal line here, there's no point whereby all these graphs are negative. However, we do have a point whereby all these graphs are positive. And where does that happen? Let me show you here. Let's choose a pen. Now, the point where these two graphs are all positive, starting from here, these graphs are being above the x-axis, right? They're all above up until the point here. At this point now, one of these graphs becomes negative. Now I want to put that in writing. This happens between the following x values: negative 90 degrees, which is what I've shown you here, up until 60 degrees, which is what I've shown you here. Now, the question is, does it include those values? Let's start here at negative 90. At negative 90, if you multiply the y values for these graphs, will you get a negative answer? No. Sorry. I made a mistake here. Almost made a mistake. Okay, I did actually make a mistake. We are saying here, the product of these graphs, it must give you a negative answer. So if it must give you a negative answer, it means they must be on different sides. One of them must be positive and the other one must be negative. Yes. So let's do that. So these graphs here, how that happens, it starts here. It starts here at this point here, at this switch over, one of these graphs becomes negative. And that's when at this area here, one of these graphs dips in to become negative and the other one stays to be positive. So now at this point, the product of these two graphs becomes a negative answer. Where does that happen? It happens at 60 degrees up until the last point here, 180 degrees. So x is between 60 degrees and 180 degrees. So now, how does that happen? How it happens is that here at 60 degrees, the graph of g is exactly at 0. So we don't include that value because of this graph, it's not yet below the x-axis. So afterwards, it becomes below, and then at 180 degrees exactly, does it include 180 degrees? Yes, because at 180 degrees, the graph of f is still above the graph of g. No, I mean, the graph of f is positive, the graph of g is negative. So the product of these two answers, it's a negative answer. So positive times negative, that's a negative answer. So we include that part there. Okay guys, I was thinking that I'm going to do 2 videos tonight, but unfortunately I'm so tired. I'll only upload this video and afterwards I'll see when do I get the time to upload the others. Goodbye. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share the video to anyone you think it might help. Goodbye.